Good afternoon, good evening, and perhaps good morning, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today to introduce Professor Luigi Rizzi, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Siena and Honorary Professor at the University of Geneva. I thank him for accepting Abralin's invitation to take part in the series of talks entitled Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online. I also want to thank all the members of Abralin's committee, especially Professor Miguel Oliveira Jr., its president, for providing our community of linguists with this really important online event. Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, is an initiative of the Associação Brasileira de Linguística in collaboration with Comité Internacional Permanent de Linguistes, Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, Associação de Linguística Aplicada do Brasil, Societas Linguística Europa, Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and Associação Internacional de Linguistique Appliquée. Abralin ao Vivo has congregated linguists from all over the world talking about linguistics from different theoretical perspectives and empirical approaches. The set of recorded talks will constitute an important collection of presentations and discussions on contemporary approach to language. Most importantly, it has been a very exciting activity during this difficult period of our lives and of our history. Professor Luigi Rizzi was on the faculty of the Department of Linguistics in European and American universities, in particular at MIT as a visiting scholar from 77 to 81, as an associate professor from 83 to 85 and the fall of 86. He was also at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, at the University of California, Los Angeles, and at the École Normale Supérieure de Paris. Rizzi is an honorary member of the Linguistic Society of America, corresponding fellow of the British Academy, member of Academia Europa, and honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's awarded the International Research Chair Blaise Pascal Paris in 2011. But more than all those honorific titles that no doubt reflect the importance of his academic and research career, Rizzi is one of the European linguists that contribute in very fundamental ways to the success of the generative enterprise. I will only highlight three very important impacts that Rizzi's research had on the generative project. One of the main topics of his research is what he calls the theory of silent syntactic positions, no pronominals, and more generally, no arguments, traces, etc. His concern with the licensing and interpretation of empty categories, especially in Romance languages such as Italian, was at the genesis of the principal and parameters model, mostly in the laying out of the pro-drop parameter. Rizzi's contribution to a typology of empty categories can be found in his seminal 82 book, Issues in Italian Syntax, and his 86 linguistic inquiry article, No Objects in Italian and the Theory of Pro. Chomsky acknowledges the fruitfulness at the discussions triggered by the lectures that he gave at GLOW conference organized by Rizzi and held in Pisa in April 79. Chomsky says, the material was then reworked in the course of lectures at MIT in 79 and 80, where I was fortunate to have the participation of a number of visitors from other institutions in the US and Europe. Since the PISA meetings, there has been considerable research by a number of linguists within more or less the framework developed in the PISA discussions, or bearing on this framework of ideas and assumptions. I owe a special debt to Luigi Rizzi for his original ideas and incisive criticism. Rizzi's second main topic of interest is the theory of locality. His book, Relativize Minimality, brings forth his other major contribution to the generative enterprise. The idea was to maximize the role of intervention and to reduce the role of barriers in the definition of government. The third is the emergency of the cartographic approach to syntactic structures. In his more quoted article, The Fine Structure of the Left Periphery, Rizzi proposed a more articulated structure for the CP domain, establishing the link between argument semantics and the scope discourse semantics. I want to finish my introduction by pointing out the division of labor between the minimalist project and the cartographic project in the generative enterprise, showing one more great contribution of Rizzi's work to this generative project. In Cinque's and Rizzi's words, the division of labor here is that minimalism focuses on the generating devices and the cartography focuses on the fine details of the generated structures. Thank you once more, and now we'll hear cartography and the grammatical explanation, the talk of our invited speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esmeralda. I hope you can hear me now. I'm very grateful to you for the kind words of introduction. Let me also express my gratitude to Miguel Oliveira, to Abralin, to the numerous institutions that participated in the creation of this series of events, which really give us an excellent opportunity to remain in touch and to discuss ideas, exchange ideas in a very difficult time of our lives. So let me try to share with you my PowerPoint. Okay, just a second. Share. I will share it in a moment. Okay, share. There is a little difficulty here. I hope I'll manage to find the right screen sharing is paused. Sorry, not yet.
Can you please try that again, Luigi?
Okay, share screen again. I do not see, just a second, I do not see.
Is it your PowerPoint file open?
Yes, it's open.
Okay.
So let me see again. It should be this one. Perhaps we should start it all over again. Let me just see if I can share. No, Zoom share. It's not a new share. Just a second. No, vieni un attimo. Non importa. Vediamo, Ok, dunque, aspetta. Vivo. Questo. Però qui non si vede.
Are you selecting the PowerPoint file?
It should be this one, but
Okay.
it's not working. No, no. Aspetta.
Can you see your PowerPoint file in your computer?
At the moment, let me just see. Just a second. It's doing
maybe
something.
It's minimized. Can you just?
Maybe it's minimized.
Yeah.
Ok. Questo. Ah, yes, here it is. Can you see it now?
Can you try it again, please?
Okay. Okay. Share. Okay.
Great, it's working now. Thank you.
Ah, fantastic, fantastic. I'm relieved. Okay, I'm sorry. It worked beautifully before, but now something happened. I don't know what. In any event, I was thanking everyone for creating this wonderful opportunity. What I'd like to do today is to talk about one of the topics that Esmeralda mentioned in her introduction. That is to say something general about the cartographic projects and focus on the map of the left periphery, and then address one particular subtopic, which is the system of criteria for expressing scope, discourse, semantics, and focus on the morphosyntactic status of these little words or morphemes that in some languages overtly mark topic, focus, WH elements, and so on and so forth. Then I'd like to turn to the general topic of the relation between cartographic analysis and cartographic projects and explanation, the intuitive notion of explanation. We can see two types of relations. Even the main discovery of cartographic projects, which is the identification of functional sequences, one can take functional sequences as explanans, to use this terminology from the philosophy of science. That is to say, as one ingredient that participates with other ingredients in the explanation of certain phenomena. And we can also take functional sequences as explananda, that is to say, as entities that in and of themselves need an explanation, need to be connected to basic principles of the language faculty. And then I'd like to conclude the presentation by presenting an approach that I have recently developed with Adriana Belletti and Naama Friedman, which addresses the issue of language acquisition and tries to ask the question, how do children acquire the fine details of cartographic maps? Okay, so the initial observation of cartographic projects is that syntactic structures are complex objects. And they're interesting objects to the extent that it is worthwhile to devote a specific line of research to the study of the detailed articulation of syntactic structures. And how can one do that? Well, one can start by drawing maps that express in a precise way the details of syntactic configuration. Now, one could observe that natural language syntax is unbounded. So one could say, how can you draw a map of an infinite space, right? A map requires some kind of limitation. Now, syntax is infinite because of the recursive nature of the structure building mechanism. Merge, for instance, if you adopt if you adopt a minimalist grammar. But the structural atoms produced by individual applications of merge and other structure building rules tend to give rise to relatively stable aggregates. That's to say, stable molecular structures, which are complex. And that's the object of cartographic research. So we want, on the one hand, to study the properties of such molecular entities and see how the atoms of syntactic representations interact to give rise to such richer and more complex entities as the functional sequences that I mentioned. So one important element to take into account, an important guideline, which really is an empirical hypothesis on the way in which natural language works, but that can be taken as a methodological guideline initially, is this kind of maxim: one formal syntactic feature corresponds to one head. This amounts to saying that the lexicon of natural languages does not have the possibility of creating complex entities, complex assemblies of formal syntactic features. Of course, we can have complex heads. We can have, for instance, a verb that is inflected for tense, aspect, mood, and so on. But such complex entities are created by some computational elaboration, by movement, essentially, by head movement. Lexical items, as they enter syntax, are simple objects. So we have some kind of local simplicity. One item can only express one formal syntactic feature, and that defines a syntactic head. And then under the cartographic magnifier, each zone of more traditional syntactic trees is split, is subdivided into much richer configurations that are these functional sequences that I mentioned. So if we take a traditional tree involving at least these three major zones, a verbal zone expressing thematic roles, essentially, argument structure, an inflectional zone expressing some such general properties as temporal, spectral, modal properties, and a complementizer zone expressing properties of scope, discourse, semantics, and the scope of operators and discourse relevant articulations like topic, comment, focus, presupposition, and the like, and we apply the one feature, one head maxim, we end up with a much richer system for each zone. So this is the familiar rendering of the IEP, the closal structure, in Cinque's work, where the IEP is split in a series of finer components, mood, modality, tense, aspect, voice components. And this is my own rendering of the left periphery of the close, a system that is delimited by two heads of force and finiteness, and that contains heads expressing such properties as topicality, focus, the position for WH and other types of operators, and other elements that I will discuss in what follows. So where does this complexity come from? Well, it comes from the recursive application of merge, recursive application of the structure building mechanism, merge in minimalist terms. And these mechanisms operate on a very rich functional lexicon, giving rise to the complex structures that we observe. So how rich is the functional lexicon then? In work coming from the typological tradition, Heine and Kuteva have identified over 100 targets of grammaticalization in their terminology, which gives us a kind of conservative order of magnitude of the number of elements of the functional lexicon. And this converges, in essence, with the work that I've done with Guglielmo Cinque, reviewing cartographic results and identifying essentially the same number of functional elements that are not only listed in the functional lexicon, that give rise to the functional sequences that we have just seen in two cases. Now, about the cross-linguistic impact of cartographic studies, we really started the work about 2 decades ago or a quarter of a century ago by looking at certain zones of the syntactic tree in Romance and Germanic. But then very quickly, that approach showed its more general vocation, and a lot of work was generated on other languages and language families. So there's a lot of work on Finno-Ugric, for instance, on Semitic languages, on sub-Saharan African languages, a lot of recent interest in East Asian languages, with the organization every other year of an international workshop on syntactic cartography in Beijing at BLCU University in Beijing. A lot of interest in Japanese, other East Asian languages, a lot of interest in Native American and Native Australian languages, Creole languages, also sign languages, in fact, have cartographic properties that have been addressed. And of course, there is a lot of work in Brazil, starting from seminal papers by Mary Cato, Carlos Mioto, and then with a number of more recent dissertations and papers by a number of other people, some which are mentioned here, Gesser, Carezemin, Tescarineto, and many others. Okay, so to give an idea of the splitting approach, in the case of the complementizer system, let's start from the beginning of the introduction of the complementizer node by John Bresnan in a very important, very influential paper in 1970. Bresnan proposes generalization. The sentence starts with a complementizer position that works both to express elements like that in English, for instance, or K in the Romance languages, and also functions as a landing side of movement, certain types of movement, like WH movement. Now, this initial proposal was extremely influential, but the first splitting was introduced by Chomsky. In fact, several years later, in Barriers, Chomsky proposes to regularize the syntax of functional elements by assuming that X-bar theory applies to them, so that the complementizer system ends up being something like two, not with a single position, but with two positions, a head position and a specifier position, distinct positions. Now, this approach immediately got a lot of attention. Let me just mention, this is more of a rational reconstruction than how the history actually went, but let me mention one interesting, simple and interesting typological argument that was proposed by Matthew Dreyer years later in favor of the splitting introduced by Chomsky. Dreyer observed that one attested language type is one which has the complementizer to the extreme right periphery and WH movement to the left, so that you inevitably need two positions to express that property. And as we are in Brazil, at least virtually, actually I am in Italy, but I'm virtually with you in Brazil, let me mention language spoken in Brazil, canela, which has the property that Dreyer talks about. As you can see from 3, the complementizer is to the right of the structure in an embedded clause, equivalent of that. But then there's WH moving to the left. And then we need 2 positions there, inevitably. And then things went fast from that point, because it was observed that different elements traditionally analyzed as complementizers, in fact, occupy different positions in the peripheral structure. So if we take Romance, Italian in particular, we see that elements like che, corresponding to that, di, which is its infinitival counterpart in control infinitives, and se, corresponding to if for indirect questions, these 3 elements, traditionally analyzed as complementizers, in fact, occupy different positions. And we can see that if we study their ordering properties with respect to a 3rd element. So che, corresponding to that, typically precedes topics expressed in Romance by the so-called clitic left dislocation construction, right? So we have che followed by topics. On the other hand, the infinitival counterpart, di, follows topics. So we get the ordering topic di. And se, if, occupies an intermediate position. It can be surrounded by topics, as we see in structures like 3, for instance. Topic, se, and then another topic. These very simple considerations already lead to a partial map of the left periphery as the one indicated in 4, with a higher position, lexicalized by che, a lower position, lexicalized by d, and then this other element, say, in an intermediate position, where it can be preceded and followed by topics. Now, these orderings are established on the basis of so-called transitivity arguments, in the sense that these elements never co-occur, but we see how they occur with 3rd elements, as it were. But so it's reassuring and interesting for this kind of evidence to look at other languages and see that the ordering abstractly postulated for Italian is in fact expressed in the same structure in other languages, like Spanish, for instance. So in so-called reported questions in Spanish, we see the sequence que, si in reported questions like 1. Reported question means somebody asks a question, somebody else reports that speech act by using an embedded structure, an embedded interrogative. This particular kind of question can illustrate the che si sequence, and then che si does not form a unit because there can be elements intervening between the 2 elements. So as in 2, for instance, we have che and then a topic and then si, okay? So we see directly that kind of structure. Other languages, like Hungarian, generalize this property, not just to reported questions, but to all indirect questions. In Hungarian, we systematically have that indirect questions are introduced by an introducer, roughly corresponding to that, and then we have lower elements that express the yes-no character of the interrogative, except that here it's a fixal, so that it attracts the verb, and we get this element always encliticized to the verb, or we have the higher element followed by a WH element in the focus position, and possibly again with the 2 elements separated by an intervening topic. So this very clearly shows that we need a very articulate, very rich left periphery if we want to incorporate all these elements. Okay, that's the analysis. We have the higher element, the OGI, and then the lower elements expressing yes-no interrogatives or WH interrogatives that move to a focus position. But we need these different items. Another kind of evidence in favor of a rich structure for the left periphery is that elements like that, English that, are quite versatile in the sense that they can lexicalize different kinds of elements in different structures. So even in English, we have constructions in which we have 2 occurrences of that surrounding, as it were, preposed adjunct clauses, so that we have this ordering. I think that if blah, 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 that something or other, so that we clearly see a rich structure for the complementizer system. Other languages use this kind of configuration in a much more systematic and less marginal way. For instance, in various northern and southern Italian dialects, we have occurrences of che that mark topics. So if we have a topic structure, the topic element can be both preceded and followed by the marker che, again suggesting a rich structure for the left periphery. And this is not a particularly exotic structure. Here it is interesting to compare Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese to show that these che type elements can lexicalize different position in an otherwise uniform left periphery. So Villa Garcia pointed out that in Spanish he describes, topics, onto Hermana here, can be surrounded by this higher che, designating declarative force, and the lower che, plausibly analyzed in this case as a topic marker. If we move to Brazilian Portuguese, in his classical work on the Brazilian left periphery, Carlos Mioto observed that we can have this double che structure, but with different interpretive and PF properties, in the sense that this is only possible when the intervening element is focalized, right? So you can see that this second occurrence of che lexicalizes focus in Brazilian Portuguese. So if we compare Villa Garcia's Spanish and Carlau Mioto's Brazilian Portuguese, we have fundamentally the same structure for the left periphery, with the first occurrence of che lexicalizing declarative force, and then the second occurrence lexicalizing respectively topic in Spanish and focus in Brazilian Portuguese. So this is again an illustration of the versatility of this element in lexicalizing different positions in different languages, and at the same time of the necessity of an expanded initial periphery of the clause. There are also languages that illustrate and that lexicalize more than two positions in the periphery. This is the case, for instance, in Mamoru Saito's analysis of the periphery, here the right periphery for reasons of word order, of Japanese. Again, in reported questions in Japanese, we find these sequences, no kato, that are analyzed by Saito as expressing respectively, as you can see from the next slide, finiteness, the interrogative character, and the reported character. In essence, we have here in the no kato sequence the mirror image of the ke, se, di sequence in Romance. So the hierarchical order, presumably, is the same in, say, Romance and an East Asian language like Japanese. Hierarchical order is the same. Linear order is the mirror image because of the headedness properties of the language, the systematic head final character of Japanese in particular. And this is true, this remains true. Whatever theory we assume for expressing headedness, so either the traditional approach in terms of a specific ordering parameter, or Keynes' approach in terms of movement, or Chomsky and Berwick's approach in terms of a parametric property of externalization. Okay, so let me now move to the criterial approach to scope discourse semantics. According to this approach, which is an important component of the study of the left periphery, this way of looking at the left periphery, the left periphery is populated by a system of functional heads that express scope discourse properties such as topicality, focus, and so on. And these heads have a double function. In syntax, they attract movement. So they trigger fundamental syntactic operation, movement to the specifier position. And at the interfaces with sound and meaning, they activate interpretive procedures, assigning the special intonational contours that often characterize these constructions, and the special interpretive properties, scope discourse properties, that also characterize these constructions. So if we take typical A-bar chains in English for a question, a topicalization structure, a focus movement structure as one ABC, according to the Criterial approach, they will have representations like two with little heads like cue, topic, focus, having this dual function. Now, in a language like English and many other languages, these heads are not realized with special morphemes, but there are languages in which special morphemes characterize such a system. So for instance, this is the case in Kwa languages. Here I'm following the analysis proposed by Enoch Cabot in his dissertation and much subsequent work. So in these languages, we observe that topicality is systematically expressed by a little word, and focus is also expressed by another little word, we. And the two marker and the topical and focal structure can co-occur in a rigid order in examples like C, with topic always preceding and being hierarchically higher than the focus in the same configuration, in the same clausal configuration. Then in other languages, we have cue markers, heads that mark and create room, as it were, for WH movement. So for instance, in certain Dutch varieties, there is a marker like of corresponding to English if, which marks certain varieties, not in the standard, WH questions, essentially, with the WH element occurring next to this element. And one can reasonably analyze ESC in French WH questions, as a cue marker. It's clear that ESC is historically more complicated, as the writing system suggests, but it's reasonable to consider it as a reanalyzed form that simply expresses Q, I mean, the position of the WH element, and it has lost the character of a structure derived from a cleft, as we have in other languages like English, for instance, and so on. Okay, so these observations are relevant to draw the conclusion that perhaps all languages work like that. Perhaps all languages express these properties structurally. Here I'm following a principle that Chomsky expressed in derivation by phase, but this really is a very basic principle of comparative syntax. Essentially, the idea is that we must start from uniformity considerations. When we compare languages, we must start from the assumption that languages are uniform. Of course, that's not true. So we have to weaken that assumption, but initial assumption must be an assumption of uniformity. That's the only way to really identify invariant and variable properties. So by taking literally this uniformity principle, it's reasonable to assume that as some languages clearly express topicality, focus, and so on as a specifier head complement structure, maybe all languages have that property. And the only difference is a clearly low-level parametric property, like the fact that the relevant criterial heads may be pronounced in some languages and may remain silent in other languages. Okay, so this has been called the syntacticization of semantic pragmatics. This simply means that cartographic representations are interface friendly. So if we have a topic comment structure like click left dislocation structure in Romance, questo libro lo dovremmo leggere domani, something like that, a topic head essentially triggers, on the one hand, triggers movement of the topic to the specifier and triggers interpretation of the topic position as the topic and of the complement position as the comment. what is the interpretation of a topic, where there is an aboutness property, right? So the comment is about the topic, essentially. And then there is an additional property, discourse linking, presumably, which requires topics to be somehow already salient in discourse, so that if we take an out-of-the-blue context, like what happened, we cannot really use a topic comment structure. We must use a simple SVO structure. What happened? A truck bumped into a bus. We could not use a topic in this particular configuration. We need some kind of connection to the previous discourse. So for instance, if a referent is introduced in the question, what happened to the bus for Rome, then we can take up the referent introduced in the answer and say, in Italian, l'autobus per Roma, un camion lo ha tamponato. So this is a legitimate context for topic comment structure. Okay, let me skip that. Then we can study the intonation, the special intonational contours going with these configurations. This relates to the experimental study of the intonational contour of topic and focus structures due to Giuliano Bocci and Bianchi, Bocci, and Kruskina in a series of papers. Just notice here that the comment, the topic has a certain level of prominence, and the comment has a hilly structure, right? So it has kind of the regular structure that we find in normal clauses. This clearly contrasts with focus structures in Italian, in which the intonational contour is very different. So in a focus structure, in a corrective focus construction, for instance, the focus has a very high prominence, and then the presupposition, what comes after the focus, is completely flattened. So it's possible to use this representation to study the properties of the intonational contours. And then there are other types of foci, narrative focus, for instance, with somewhat different intonation, new information focus, and so on and so forth. Now, let me briefly look at the morphosyntactic analysis of the markers that we have observed in certain languages, like the Kwa languages. We have assumed so far, without argument, that such markers are part of the closal spine, right? So that they attract the focus, in this case, to the specifier. There's an alternative that should be taken into account that has been discussed a few years ago in a series of workshops, which is that maybe such markers could be analyzed as case-like elements attached to focus, topic, and so on and so forth. So here we need some kind of empirical argument to decide which one of these two representations is correct. And there is a series of arguments that we can consider. For instance, we can observe that if such markers are part of the closal spine, we expect to find them occurring when, for instance, a focal element has been moved to the periphery, but not when the element is in situ. And this is what we observe. So if we look at echo questions, for instance, he went where, with the particular echo intonation, in a language like Gungbe, for instance, we do not hear the focal marker associated to the WH element in situ, but only to the element when it is moved to the left periphery. Same story for the ESC marker in French. Moved WH elements have the marker, in situ WH elements cannot have the marker, so that this goes well with the idea that such criterial markers are part of the closal spine and are not case-like elements attached to particular items. Let me just mention another type of evidence. If such markers are part of the closal spine, and we have, for instance, a conjunction of topics or foci, like John and Bill, we expect only one marker to appear after the conjunction. Whereas if they were case-like elements, you would expect them to be able to distribute of the conjuncts. What we observe is that in languages like Cumbe, for instance, only one marker can appear in case of conjoined topics, and we cannot distribute the marker, or conjoined foci, as in this case, and we cannot distribute the marker across over the coordinate structure. So all these properties strongly suggest that the markers are part of the clausal structure. Let me just mention one final type of evidence, which has to do with the fact that if such markers are part of the clausal structure, we expect them to interact with certain processes, like movement, for instance. And in fact, we observe that if you think of the Q marker in Dutch varieties, it is found in indirect questions, so something like, I don't know who marker John saw. But it cannot appear in main questions. Why is it so? Well, it's so because Dutch is a V2 language, hence in main questions, the position next to the initial element must be occupied by the inflected verb, and therefore the inflected verb in second position and the marker cannot occur. So this is very simple distributional syntactic evidence that such markers are part of the clausal spine. Okay, let me skip some conclusions here, and let me simply say that these arguments support the hypothesis that under the uniformity hypothesis, Chomsky's uniformity hypothesis, all languages can be analyzed in this way, with the relatively trivial parametric differences that in some languages markers are overt, and in other languages they are null. Okay, so let me quickly move to the notions of explanation and how they interact with cartographic structures. Given the discovery of functional sequences, as I said, one can take a functional sequence as an explanans, that is to say, as a particular ingredient that enters into the explanation of some other phenomenon. For instance, the sequence is critical for a number of recent analyses of death trace effects that really depend on the nature of the little head that is adjacent to the subject position. Or if you think, for instance, of much work in nanosyntax, a lot of the explanatory job in nanosyntax is done by the functional sequence. For instance, in work on constraints on syncretism, the functional sequence that is involved in case systems, for instance, is critical. On the other hand, of course, one can take functional sequences as explananda, that is to say, on entities that in and of themselves need an explanation. And so this raises the question, how can we deduce the properties that we observe in functional sequences from more general principles, general and plausible principles of the human language faculty? And this is an extremely important part of cartographic work, right? In the critical literature on cartography, there is sometimes some discussion of cartography as a templatic approach, as if the assumption was that once the right map is identified, we get a template and that's the end of the explanatory process. That's not at all what is intended. So this idea of templatic approach is a real misnomer, I believe. The identification of the right map is only the beginning of the explanatory process, right? Once we observe the generalization in the order of elements, then we should immediately ask the question, why is it so? Why is it that we get that particular sequence and not other imaginable sequences? Now, if we take cartographic discoveries and functional sequences as explananda in this sense, then I think cartographic work can function as a very powerful generator of empirical issues for linguistic theory. And this is badly needed, I think. It's very important for linguistic theory to keep the capacity to identify interesting puzzles, new puzzles. That's extremely important to keep the attention alive in the scientific community, as it were. And I think that cartographic work can play a significant role in this sense. Okay, so let me conclude by briefly looking at language acquisition, by looking at, again, cartographic structures as elements that provide explanatory elements for a particular domain, which is the study of language acquisition. This is work that I've done recently with Naama Friedman and Adriana Belletti. The basic question is, how are cartographic structures acquired by the child? So on the one hand, we want to know how it works. Is it the case that these very complex structures are there as early as we can test them, or they are acquired en bloc? Let's say the whole left periphery crops up at some point, or they are acquired piecemeal, piece after piece. And so we want to pursue that work. We want to have an answer to this kind of questions. And we also want to see if the study of acquisition can illuminate the study of cartography, can offer types of evidence that may be relevant for also for the study of adult cartography. So there, we are trying to suggest that there can be a very useful interaction between cartographic studies and the study of acquisition. The kind of logic or hypothesis that we have proposed in a recent paper is this called the growing trees hypothesis, according to which zones of the tree are acquired bottom-up, in the sense that the child starts with the lowest zone, and then each zone somehow defines a stage in acquisition. So we have children in stage A, and then a treelet B crops up on top of A. So we have children in a second stage, and then another treelet C may crop up on top of that. And then we have a richer structure in a third stage. And what characterizes this bottom-up acquisition is the fact that we cannot jump across one stage. We cannot have children moving directly from A to C, as it were. Okay, that's the logic. And in order to do that kind of study, we use Guttman scales, a time-honored device, which is very useful to express implicational relations between properties. So we end up with configurations of this kind. Each child corresponds to one line. Then we can see here that some children are simply out of the system. Some children have only property A, but not B and C. Some other children have property A and B, but not property C. And then some other children have the three properties, essentially, A, B, and C. So this is the device that can be used. Now, the kind of cartographic element that we need here is a kind of backbone of the left peripheral map. You see, it's a more simplified map in which we abstract away from a number of properties. For instance, in Romance, we have a proliferation of topic positions that we abstract away from here, and we just focus on the essential backbone of the left peripheral map with force, then a position for interrogative, and then we look at the topic position and a focus position, now a very robustly attested cross-linguistic pattern found in European languages, but in many other language types, Finno-Ugric and so on and so forth, is that topics typically are higher than focal positions. Here, we'll not discuss focal positions really, but we'll have them represented by WH elements, essentially. So we only look at cases of focalization in which the focus position is realized as WH element. So we really call it Q position. We looked at these properties in the acquisition of Hebrew. Let me just mention one cartographic property here, which is that regular WH elements, like who, for instance, typically occur lower than the topic position. So if we have a topic, we have first the topic and then the WH element, corresponding to what we just saw in this structure, with topics typically higher than Q positions or focus positions. But certain WH elements, particularly the WH element corresponding to Y, occupies a higher position. So Y, in fact, differs from other WH elements in that it occupies this higher position closer to the top of the left peripheral map. And this can be shown very directly in the fact that in adult Hebrew, Y typically precedes topics, whereas other WH elements follow topics. So with that in mind, we end up with a detailed map for Hebrew that largely corresponds to the map that we have already illustrated in the case of Romance languages. This is based on our own work and work by Chomsky. So we have the highest position, the fourth position, which also corresponds to the position that he used in relative clauses. The relative head will be here in the highest part of the left peripheral map. Then we have this interrogative position that is used by certain WH elements like Y. Then we have the topic position. Then the Q position that is used by other types of WH elements. Then we have the mod position, the modifier position that is used in cases of preposing of adverbial elements, like an adverbial element, like suddenly John left. Such an adverbial element occupies a left peripheral position, which is neither properly topical nor properly focal. So we need a third position for preposed adverbials. And then the structure ends with the finiteness head. And then we have the structure of the IP, which can be as complex as the Cinquean IP, but we will not really focus on that in any detail. So here are the questions that we want to ask. How is this detailed map acquired by the child who is learning Hebrew? Is that structure there as soon as we can test the child, or is it acquired en bloc? The whole structure at some point is not there and then it's all there. Or is it acquired piecemeal and in a way that does not respect the structural hierarchy? Or, point 4, is it acquired piecemeal in ways respecting the growing trees logic? That is to say, by incrementally acquiring higher and higher zones of the tree. Okay, we did an analysis of spontaneous production and then also a longitudinal study and a repetition study, but let me just look at the results. There are children who are in stage 1, essentially an IP stage, a stage in which no part of the left periphery is used. So that we observe these children, no sign of left peripheral constructions. We have some structure here because, for instance, the agreement system is active, so that it's not just a VP, we have more functional structure. The object of an accusative verbs is moved to subject position. So we have properties of the IP structure, but no manifestation of the presence of the left periphery. That's stage 1. Then stage 2, there is a subtree corresponding to the lower part of the left periphery that crops up on top of the structure of the IP. And this structure includes WH questions, different types of WHL questions, subject questions, object questions, certain adjunct questions, but nothing else. Or rather, one more thing, which is preposed adverbials. We have structures like now I take this, for instance, with the preposing of the adverbial, but no topic structure, no relative structures, and no other structures involving the higher part of the left periphery. That's the second stage. And the third stage, here, the left periphery is manifested in its full glory. So we not only have the IP, not only have the lower part of the left periphery, but also the higher part of the left periphery, including the position for relative pronouns, which is very high, adjacent to the nominal head of the relative construction. Then we have why questions that show up here and that are not present in the previous stage. And we have topicalization structures. So we have relative clauses here, topicalization, sentence embedding. I think that I see that something or other, and root why questions corresponding to the upper part of the left periphery. So we have this difference between why questions and other types of WH questions. So it's consistent with the fact that why questions are expressed higher up in the structure. It's not just a matter of clausal embedding, right? Because we have some root constructions like topicalization, for instance, root why questions that are only manifested in this third stage. So it's not just a matter of, let's say, embedding is acquired in this third stage. No, the constructions that show up are those that use the higher part of the left periphery. And it's not a matter of movement versus non-movement. So we have in this third stage, simple embedding, like declarative embedding, which does not involve any kind of movement, why questions, which according to certain analysis also does not involve any kind of movement. So it's really a matter of the presence of the critical part of the periphery only in the highest part of the structure. So here is our Guttman scales corresponding respectively. Well, here we have some children who are not even in the IP stage. Then we have some children in the IP stage, but with no manifestation of the left periphery. Here we have some children which manifest the lower part of the left periphery. So WH questions, adverb preposing, but no topicalization, no relative, and so on and so forth. And then the other children who have the whole structure of the left periphery, also with the constructions that involve the higher part of the configuration. This is an actual Guttman scale with the different properties that are observed. As you see, there are some holes in the structure, but it is very clear that some children only have the properties that go with the structure of the IP. Other children have the properties that go with the IP and the lower part of the left periphery, and other children have the whole configuration. Okay, so cartographic maps help defining stages in acquisition. At the same time, cartographic the observations in acquisition help us adjudicating certain questions. For instance, we can look at the structure of yes/no questions and ask the question, when do yes/no questions appear? Answer, yes/no questions appear in the second stage, so that the landing site, the position that marks yes/no question must be in the lower part of the left periphery. And then there's this property that we observed about why questions that differ from other types of questions. And we have evidence distinguishing topicalization from simple adverb preposing, because simple adverb preposing is already observed in children in stage 2, whereas topicalization is only observed in stage 3, and that corresponds to the different height of the position targeted by genuine topics or by preposed adverbs. Okay, number of theoretical questions are raised by this approach. It seems clear that the left periphery is organized in zones, different positions, different heads are organized in chunks of structures. And this raises the question, what constitutes a zone? Why is it that we distinguish the lower left periphery and the higher left periphery? So here again, we are back to taking a cartographic property as illustrated by acquisition as an explanandum, as something that needs an explanation. And the usual players come to mind. Maybe interface properties determine the subdivision of zones of the left periphery. Maybe topics appear in the higher part because of their connection with discourse linking. Perhaps certain formal principles are relevant. For instance, locality principles may be relevant. Phase theory may play a role. Here, the very general problem is raised of combining cartographic research and phase theory. Clearly, if we adopt cartographic representations, phase theory saying that C is a phase determining node will not be sufficient, because C in fact corresponds to a series of nodes, so that we'll have to identify which node or which nodes of the left periphery define phases. So this opens additional questions. And then there are, of course, important empirical questions that are raised. Now, we saw that essentially the acquisition of the left periphery in Hebrew follows these three steps, these three stages. But what about other languages? What about other languages illustrating certain parametric differences? For instance, what about the many languages which also permit lower topic position? Is the topic acquired earlier in such language? We don't know. It's something that should be studied. And then, of course, the question arises of whether and to what extent we can extend this growing trees logic to the development of other categories. Can we apply that logic to the development of the IP, for instance, identifying different stages there, or to the development of the DP? All these questions are to be asked in future work. So let me conclude already a little bit over time. So cartographic research over about a quarter of a century gave rise to a very rich body of knowledge, of work, results, identification of generalizations, theoretical analysis, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the study of the development of cartographic maps is just at the beginning. So clearly, this trend is more at the level of formulating hopefully interesting questions than at the level of offering solid answers. Still, I think that these early forms of the growing trees approach look quite promising. So I think it is reasonable to hope that by using this logic, we may be led to revisit all questions in acquisition, and perhaps more importantly, will be led to discover new developmental properties which may have an impact on the general study of structural representations, so also for adult cartography, and of their acquisition. And on this promissory note, I will conclude, thanking you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very intriguing and with solid results and lots of new questions in this Price talk. So now I will tell you what people are saying and make some of the questions for you to answer, if that's okay. So there are lots of hellos and greetings, but I will start with a question by Renato Lacerda. If the focus criterion is not assumed to be a necessity, what would go wrong in the analysis of Gunde, We, and Dutch of if WH elements and folk occupy the specified position of Cinque on the specifier of any other complementizer?
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I think I did not mute my microphone. Okay. Right. So the question raises an important issue, which is the association or lack thereof of cue and focus, which shows a certain level of variation, even within the same language. For instance, if you look at the language that I have studied in more detail cartographically, which is Italian, of course, there is a difference between main questions and embedded questions, in that in main questions, cue and focus are necessarily associated. In fact, if you think of my 1997 paper, I simply assumed there that WH elements in main questions move to the focus position, not to a special cue position. And the evidence, well, there are different kinds of evidence, but a very simple kind of evidence is that WH elements cannot co-occur with other close initial foci, right? So that suggests that there is a single position that is used. But then if this is taken as the criterion, and if you look at embedded questions, you see that in embedded questions, it is possible to have a focus and the cue element co-occurring, generally in a rigid order, so focus and then the cue element. So this suggests that in main questions, there is a systematic association between cue and focus, whereas in embedded questions, you can dissociate the two elements and you can see them possibly co-occur. Now, the association is also suggested by the fact that if you look at the Gungbe case, you see that at least in main questions, the cue marker is in fact identical to the focus marker. So both in questions and in focalization, you use the same marker when. Now, the last part of the question was about the fact that, I mean, couldn't we just use finiteness, if I understood correctly, without assuming other projections? Well, here, what is interesting is that we observe in certain languages that we need more heads. Again, if you go back, just to give one example, to the Dutch varieties that I mentioned before, you see that in such varieties, one possible form for embedded questions is what if, where if is the cue marker, but then this if can also be followed by another element of the complementizer system. So you have things like V of that, so something like what if that. And clearly we need some other position to express the position of this that, and in reasonable analysis, that could be the finiteness position. So this is very simple evidence that we cannot get away with just one head and specifier position. We need more. And in many other languages, we see similar arrangements.
Thank you. Let's see another question from the Laboratório de Cartografia. So thank you, Luigi, for such a vibrant lecture. It's always a great pleasure. to hear the question. I am asking a question I didn't have time to ask in your flash mob with Galego organized by Cecilia Pollet. It has to do with the relation between Chomsky phases and the cartography sequence. Should we expect some cross-linguistic variation regarding the category corresponding to the low phase across languages? So, Terrara, a Brazilian native language, would spell out the V, the minimal V phase in the projection corresponding to T pass, whereas it seems that Brazilian Portuguese would have it in T anterior. Hence, should one expect Chomsky's VP-CP phases to vary cross-linguistically across the cartographic functional sequences?
Okay. Thank you very much to the Cartographic lab for the nice words and for the question. I think the question really presupposes a very important and large question. I think that phase theory is essentially right, and I also think that cartography is essentially right. So we have got to put them together inevitably, right? So that the question arises of what heads in the richer maps correspond to phase heads. And I've illustrated this with the discussion of the left periphery. And of course, exactly the same kind of problem arises at the level of the lower phase, because it's clear, I didn't say anything about that, but it's clear that also the small VP structure requires a cartography, perhaps along the line of work that has been done by Ramchand, by Harley, and so on, in which, in fact, there isn't just one little V element, but there is a proliferation of such elements with functions in theta assignment, for instance, and differing on the basis of the differences in verbal semantics. So we need that kind of map, and then we need to ask the question, which one of these elements is the one that determines, which one or which ones, the one that determines the phasal character of the structure. Now, the question really is about cross-linguistic variation. Of course, there could be cross-linguistic variation. I think one relatively promising, one certainly promising approach to certain aspect of variation is to try to reduce them to other properties. For instance, you mentioned Gallego, with whom I discussed these topics a couple of weeks ago. Gallego has this view that depending on properties of head movement, of verb movement, essentially, there's a kind of a phase sliding phenomenon that extends the structure of the phase, so that the definition of phases is not just static, depending on the position of the phase defining level, but is a function of the further movements that a phase defining element can undergo. So that could be an element that could determine cross-linguistic variation. I don't know if that is of any use for the particular case that was mentioned in the question, the distinction between Brazilian Portuguese and some native language spoken in Brazil that I do not know, but certainly I would try out I'd like to really try Gallego's theory to see if some elements of variation can be reduced to that. And if not, some kind of parameterization will have to be assumed.
Thank you. Another question. Delanges, Dali. In terms of topicalization in main clause, do we have a parametric variation between languages? Can we assume that LP, there is requirement for prosodic category as their edge features? Because somehow we could see prosodic different feature in related to LP.
Right, certainly. Okay, thank you. Yes, well, I do think there is parametric variation in topic structures in different respects. One is that in some languages, only one topic is possible. We cannot have 2, 3, 4, 5 topics. In other languages, a potentially unlimited number of topics is possible. So if you take clitic left dislocation in Romance, you can have 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, you're limited by argument structure because you don't have that many arguments to topicalize, but clearly topicalization per se is consistent with a number of cases. Now, it is possible that some elements of this variation can be reduced to other principles so that we do not need a primitive parameterization. For instance, I believe that if you compare English and Romance, English typically allows one topic. I mean, 2 topics are very hard. So something like Mary, this book, I will give 2. Very strange, very difficult to accept. This could have a principled explanation. That this could be due to the fact that English uses null operators for topics to mediate between the topic and the gap in the sentence, so that we cannot have 2 topics because one null operator would inevitably cross the other, and we would be back to a locality violation that Esmeralda mentioned in her presentation. So in some cases, maybe we do not need an independent parameter. In other cases, we may need an independent parameter. Now, the other part of the question was about intonation and was the fact that we have special intonational properties in the left periphery, but of course also in the rest of the clause. Well, on the one hand, one can observe that as we have a left periphery, we also have to postulate a low periphery, a right periphery. This was studied in work by Adriana Belletti and much later work. And in fact, this is one element that suggests to me that there is something genuinely correct about the notion phases, because the CP phase and the VP phase both have peripheries specialized in expressing properties of scope discourse. So that, of course, if we have a lower topic and a lower focus and so on and so forth, we'll have intonational properties related also to the elements of this low periphery. Of course, we also have intonational properties that are not directly related to peripheries, right? We have nuclear stress rule that applies quite independently from these properties and from the informational structure of the clause. So intonation is something that exists independently, but it's clear that the certain marked forms of intonation seems to be closely related to the presence of the criterial heads in the sense that I tried to define.
Thank you. And we have some more questions. Now we have Sandra Guarizini. Thank you, Luigi, for the excellent conference. We think about the intervention effects in acquisition. Are we before a grammar-based GB or extra grammatical EG analysis?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sandra, for the question. In fact, in the paper on the growing trees approach, we observe that there is also a fourth phase in the use of the left periphery, in addition to those that we identify, which is characterized by capacity of dealing with structures involving intervention. For instance, relative clauses in which the relative head is lexically restricted and the intervening subject is also lexically restricted. So children at age 4, 5, even 6 have very serious problems with structures like show me the lady that the old man is pushing, for instance, right? Very difficult. And this has to do with intervention. This may be analyzed in terms of relativized minimality, as we have proposed in independent work with Naama Friedman and Adriana Belletti and various other co-authors. Now, this property is, in a sense, relatively orthogonal to the properties of growing trees. Here, it's not a matter of having a certain landing site for movement. Clearly, landing site for movement is there at some point, as we have seen children at age 3 or certainly 4 can produce relative clauses, both subject and object relatives, but still have very serious problems in producing or understanding structures with intervention effects. So this is, I mean, dealing with these configurations that we characterized as configurations of inclusion, featural inclusion in terms of featural relativized minimality, is an independent and orthogonal property, which defines a further phase. So once the CP structure is completely in place in the growing trees approach, then the child acquires the capacity to deal with these more complex structures, but that's independent. That doesn't have to do with the growth of the tree. If I understood correctly your question, whether these properties are grammatical or extra grammatical, I strongly believe that there is a grammatical basis for all these properties. Clearly for growing trees, obviously, right here, it's a grammatical element that develops, but also for the capacity to deal with certain violations of locality of the kind that I mentioned, which also refers to a grammatical principle, like the appropriate version of relativized minimality, which undergoes, again, certain developmental effects. But I really strongly believe that there is a strong grammatical basis for all these properties.
Thank you. Another question. Can we assume, is John P. Can we assume multiple specifiers of a single projection for the left periphery, as opposed to an articulated periphery with different independent separate functional projections? Is it the case that non-cartographic approaches failed because it's hard to restrict the ordering of multiple specifiers for a single projection CP?
Yeah, okay, thank you. This is an important question that applies to my work from the left periphery, that applies to Cinque's work on the structure of the IP. I think that the clearest kind of evidence in favor of an approach that is locally simple, right? Because what characterizes this one feature, one head business is the hypothesis that syntactic representations are locally simple. I mean, if you take a kind of zooming lens or magnifier lens, you see very simple structures with heads that have only one feature that licenses one specifier, and the complexity is determined by the recursive application of merge, essentially, that you can add other structures on top of that structure, but each individual structure is very simple. And that's a very strong intuition. Complexity arises from the recursive application of rules. I think very straightforward kind of evidence in favor of the view that we need all these head positions is that it's not just a matter of ordering of phrases, ordering of specifiers, which could be dealt with in a variety of ways, undoubtedly, also in a way that would involve single heads with multiple specifiers, but rather is the fact that we see individual heads. In fact, in the talk, I tried to present a number of cases in which it's clear that we need several heads. For instance, several occurrences of that in the examples that I quoted, occurrences of that and if, occurrences of different elements like the no kato sequence in Japanese. In all these cases, we undoubtedly see sequences of heads, so that here we cannot get away with the assumption of a single head which may license different specifiers. So apart from the question of whether or not one can naturally account for ordering constraints, there is very straightforward evidence that we need several heads because we just hear them in so many languages. I think the same kind of consideration holds for the structure of the AP and for in favor of Cinque's approach. We have that the verb can occur in different languages in all these intermediate positions between adverbials, which really suggests that there are head positions all the way. Otherwise, you just expect verbs to appear in a low position and then in a high position, and that would be it, basically, even if you find independent ways of expressing the order of adverbials, right? So it seems to me the simple evidence is that these heads can be detected by the fact that they are pronounced in so many languages.
Thank you. I think that we had everybody says thank you for your answers and congratulate you for your talk. And I wonder if you want to say something for the people before we finish our section.
Well, I just like to thank again everybody involved in this wonderful initiative, which from now on I will really follow closely, because I just looked at the list of talks that you organize. It's absolutely impressive. So I think it's a wonderful initiative that really helps us cope with an extremely difficult situation. So thank again to Abraling, thank you, Esmeralda, thank you, Miguel, and thanks to all the associations that were involved in this absolutely excellent initiative. Thank you very much.
I also want to thank you, Rizzi, Miguel, and everybody that attended the talk and asked wonderful questions that clarify and put other questions in our minds. Thank you very much, and see everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.